Why would one climb mountains? Why would you do anything? Why do you ski? Why do you fall in love?
That's a question that has been asked as long as climbers have been walking up hills. You know, the classic response, of course, came from Mallory.
Because it is there.
Why people climb, I don't think there's any one reason. I think you have to look at each climber's background and their personal history.
You wanted to climb, for the sake of climbing as an adventure.
Why would you endure hardship to come and climb mountains when you can just stay at home?
Why are they doing this? And we are doing it for the money they bring us, for our income. But why are they doing it? Was our question too.
You've got to be willing to go out there and stretch and venture into the unknown and not know what the outcome is going to be. And sometimes neat things happen.
That's ever happened to you?
Best thing. What is the best way? Meeting with the people or?
Just in general, when you look back at your life, what do you think is the best thing that ever happened to you?
Yeah, best thing that I changed myself. I become mountaineer,
His is a story of lives changed by mountains.
Higher.
And one mountain towered above all the rest.
Higher. To Earth's pinnacle, Everest.
The son of a monk and a housekeeper, Everest would be his path out of poverty, an icy promised land leading to a better life. It was not the route his parents wanted him to follow, but even as a small child, Nawang Gombu revealed the determination he would need to reach the top.
And in the Tibetan culture, you have to have, one in the family that's sent to the monastery to become a monk, and you get your education there also.
What I do know is that Gombu was sent by his family to go to the Rongbuk Monastery on the north side of Everest, Tibet, at about close to 17,000 feet as a young man.
And I've been to Rongbuk, I've been to the village where they were from and where they were born, and it's pretty rough out there, especially at that time.
What he mentions is they were really strict. And he used to tell me about stories about how, what the monks would do.
It was a very rigid kind of a life, and how they had to, they would get beaten up.
And he had this very poignant story that he used to tell, where the monks, the older monks, used to mercilessly beat him during the day. But at night, while he was sleeping, they would come and touch his feet for forgiveness.
And at some point, Gombu and one of his monks in training friends decided that it was time to escape from Rongbuk.
It was through the local loo, the toilet, where he really managed to, through the hole, he jumped and ran away.
I just said, "You what?"
It wasn't a very nice exit they had because it was through where the toilets were or something of that sort.
Monastery latrines are unimaginable to a Western idea.
He has a very close friend of his who he's with, and they're running into the night and being, I guess, hosted by friends while the hunt is on for him from the monastery.
And in the middle of Tibet, they make their way back across the Nangpa into Nepal and home.
He was not scared of his teacher, he was not scared of his parents, but he didn't want to become a monk, so he left the monastery and went across this really high pass, which is unbelievable for a young boy like him at that age.
I think it's extraordinary that he had the capacity to walk away from that monastery and think that he could pull it off and get back home.
The Nangpa Pass leading to Nepal would be a challenge for people with the best clothing. For little boys like these on foot, safe passage would seem miraculous. Gombu was only 11 at the time. He said it took them 5 days to cross the pass.
You have to come up on a glacier, and there are crevices there. The Nangpa is nearly 19,000 feet high. It's plus 18. It's quite high even for the Sherpas to ordinarily come and go across it.
It was really harsh and difficult at, almost 18,000 feet, in winters, temperature probably dropping down to below 30, 40.
He spoke about the fact that they didn't have shoes, so they tied like plastic bags and whatever they could find because he had to cross through the snow.
He decided, at such a young age that he's not going to be a monk. So that shows what kind of a person he was.
Even as an adult, trying to make your way across the Nangpa at those altitudes for that number of days out with absolute minimum of gear and clothing. And for a boy 10, 12 years old to try to pull this off, maybe that's one of the blessings of youth.
He escaped from there and came over to Nepal and then Darjeeling, and then started joining his uncle for the climbing.
A lot of people don't know that Darjeeling is where the history of Sherpa mountaineering actually begins. It's not in Nepal, because the first mountaineering expeditions that went off to Nangpa Parbat, K2, Eric Shepton, all of these people, the people who climbed the Himalayan mountains, the Sherpas, were from Darjeeling.
The word Sherpa, the literal translation is man from the east. And about 500 years ago, Sherpas migrated from eastern Tibet towards the west.
After passing through Nepal, many would eventually end up in Darjeeling, a British hill station in India where tea gardens still blanket the landscape. And on a clear day, workers and residents have a view of Kanchenjunga, the third highest mountain in the world.
During the early part of the 1900s, there were expeditions that were starting to go on Everest, and they needed people to help carry their equipment, and so they hired the locals while they were not, basically traders, agriculturists, farmers, growing potatoes mainly. So this was a side income to go on these climbs, and it turned out that because living in altitude, being really hardy people, turned out that we were actually quite strong and quite capable of climbing mountains. So when my father climbed Everest, the word Sherpa became part of the dictionary.
His father, Tenzing Norgay, would become famous for summiting Everest with Sir Edmund Hillary in 1953, the first official summit in history. And on that climb, the youngest Sherpa was his nephew, 17-year-old Nawang Gombu.
Oh yes, very ambitious. I think probably one of the reason he had this great ambition was probably because of his uncle. He wanted to become like him.
Yeah, he was incredibly strong. I mean, as you know, he was built like an ox.
He had a kind of round kind of chest. You see, it was bigger up here than the rest of the body. So probably he had big lungs. And then he was a very, very energetic fellow. He couldn't sit still.
Barely 5 feet tall, he had the determination of a giant. Twice on the 53 expedition, he carried 60-pound loads to an altitude of 26,000 feet on Everest without supplemental oxygen. He shouldered the heavy cylinders of air for others to use, which led this outspoken teenager to question the expedition leader.
He asked Lord Hunt, "We are carrying 2 cylinders, why are you carrying only 1? That's not justified." And he was a young boy. So Lord Hunt, he called Tenzing and said, "This is what your nephew is asking me." So he just laughed and, so he had the guts to ask him, "Why are you carrying only 1 cylinder?"
The success of this expedition captured the imagination of people around the world, an accomplishment that seemed as likely as someone walking on the moon. And it would change everything for Sherpas, for climbers, and for Gombu. On the heels of the first ascent, Indian Prime Minister Nehru saw an opportunity to bring the world to India's backyard, establish a climbing school in Darjeeling, appoint Tenzing Norgay director, and teach others to follow in his footsteps.
The last thing you would think is the Prime Minister promoting a sense of adventure in the country where people had nothing to eat. And so I thought it was quite brave of him to ask my father to set up this climbing school.
They had envisioned the idea of the Indian youth of the plains to go up to the mountains, learn about the Himalaya and climb Himalayan peaks.
It's been very, very successful. It's produced countless Everesters.
The school gave Gombu a foothold for his dreams. In 1954, he was hired as one of the first instructors at the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute, known as HMI. To improve their skills, they spent 6 weeks in Switzerland, learning rock climbing and rope training. And when he wasn't teaching, Gombu looked for work on other expeditions.
I went the first time the American expedition, Makalu 54.
On Makalu, he met Americans Will Seary and Willie Unsold, a connection that would ultimately lead to an invitation to return to Everest.
He was a very determined man. He knew what he wanted to do. And one of the things he knew he had to do was climb Everest, because it was still a rare and difficult achievement back in those days. He knew he had to learn English, and he knew he had to take risks.
I think he just wanted to do it like, be the topmost climber. He wanted to achieve as many summits as possible.
The years filled with expeditions to giants of the Himalaya, Sasir Kangri, Nanda Devi, Cho Oyu. And finally, in 1960, another chance at Everest.
We were within 600-700 feet of summit. We could have got to the top. But once the weather was bad, and because of the strong winds, the oxygen mask which we had, they were blocking.
Colonel Bulkumar huddled in the cold with Gombu on the first Indian attempt to reach the rooftop. But like so many others before and after, they were forced to retreat.
Biggest decision of our life at that time, because he has not climbed Everest even once, was taken without saying a word. He got up.
Went back down.
Opportunity knocked again in 1962 when an American tourist stopped at HMI hoping to get a photo taken with Tenzing. The tourist met Gombu and told him about the next expedition, an American expedition, and suggested he join.
Gombu spoke English fairly well, and he was very intelligent.
Norman Durenforth was an American filmmaker with a passion for Everest. Raised in Switzerland, he followed the Swiss in 1952 when they tried and failed to summit.
I went this high with the Bell and Howell camera.
The idea of an American expedition proved so tempting, he quit a job as a college professor to lead it.
3 years I worked on it to raise the money. I finally raised close to $500,000, and in those days, that was a lot of money. In the American Alpine Club thing, I let it be known I was looking for qualified people, and anybody interested should contact me. Gombu was with an American expedition before to Makalu. Willie Unsold was there, and Will Seary was the leader of that expedition. And he was very much impressed with Gombu. Gombu was teaching at the Himalayan Institute in Darjeeling, and he was a relative of Tenzing. So it was a logical thing.
But it was not an easy decision for Gombu.
And one of the greatest risks he took was in 1963 when he went to climb Everest, because he left behind at home a pregnant wife, 2 young children, and he wasn't even sure if he was going to get back to a job.
He was given a leave of absence from HMI, but told he would not be paid for his time away. In memoirs dictated to his family, he said he asked Tenzing for a letter of recommendation that might help him later on. He says Tenzing told him because he was a government officer, he could not do it.
That has the biggest impact on his life, because anybody in need, he's always given a recommendation letter because he knows how it feels like.
To not get it?
Yes.
In the compound of Kathmandu's Hotel Royal,
Gombu was hired by the American team and soon found himself in the middle of an enormous operation.
I first met Gombu in Kathmandu when our expedition all descended on this exotic place. He was just this little man who was clearly knew what he was doing, and it was so full of energy and helping to create some order out of the chaos that we were so wonderfully establishing there.
Down and up goes the caravan, a vast millipede.
He was one of 37 Sherpas. There were 900 porters carrying 27 tons of material that included scientific research projects partially sponsored by National Geographic.
We walked 185 miles from Kathmandu to base camp. Took us a month. So for a month, Gombu and I and the team are exchanging pleasantries and talking. And right away, he proved himself to be a real gentleman and a tremendous person.
It was apparent, I think probably during the course of the approach march, that he and Jim just sort of connected as a pair.
We wanted to give at least one Sherpa a chance to get to top, not just the Americans.
I knew he'd been high before, and he was strong, and he carried a good pack.
You could sort of tell by the twinkle in his eye what he wanted to do.
And I could communicate with him as compared to most of the other Sherpa didn't speak it as well. Norman asked me how I felt about climbing with Gombu. I said, that's great, that's great. So.
Politically, it was a good move at the time, and we welcomed Gombu into the group. He was a great addition.
And then, suddenly,
it was a dangerous undertaking for porters and climbers alike. Aging bridges collapsed. Avalanche and falling ice were constant threats.
during the second day of climbing, a group of men are threading their way up through the labyrinth when a cliff of ice collapses. John Breitenbach, age 27, of Jackson, Wyoming, lies dead and buried in a tomb of fallen ice.
The team mourned his loss and struggled with the idea of moving on, but eventually the expedition continued.
Whittaker and the Sherpa Nawang Gombu have been chosen to make the first try for the top.
They made an odd-looking pair, the 6'5" American and the Sherpa nearly a foot and a half shorter, but they were equals in other ways. Both shared the same dream, to make it to the top.
And the day that they headed out of advanced base camp, we were all there to see them off, and Gombu had this grin that was from here to here. He was so excited.
Fine, we're leaving for the summit tomorrow. Wish us luck. This is Camp 6. Over and out.
And on the morning of May 1st, the peak is boiling in its plume of snow.
And we didn't think that Gombu and Big Jim would make it.
Hillary was in the valley, next valley over, and he said it won't be climbed today because the plume was blowing off that thing, and we were just in that damn jet stream.
The day that Jim and Gombu got to the top, the wind was really creaming, and that they were out there doing it was pretty impressive.
They pushed past 50-mile-an-hour winds, ignored 30-below temperature, summiting at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And there would be no question about who was first. They reached the summit together.
We were about out of oxygen and everything, and so Gombu, you first, was shouting through the mask. And so, and Gombu, I could see his eyes crinkle up in the kind of a smile. You first, Big Jim. No, okay, Gombu. And so we went side by side together to the summit. First American and second Sherpa to stand on the highest point of Earth.
And at last, they are there, on top of the world. Jim Whittaker and Nawang Gombu.
And once you got there and looked out at that vastness, it must have been a powerful moment.
Well, no, because we were so battered and so forth, there was no powerful moment until I got down to base camp, was when I thought, Jesus Christ, we got the mountain.
When he summited with the Americans, it came out in the radio, All India Radio.
Gombu's wife Sita was listening at home, 8 months pregnant with their son Finjo. The baby would be born in early June as Gombu was returning from the nearly 4-month-long expedition.
It was the risk he took, and he knew that he had to take the risk. And so he did it. Luckily for us, and luckily for him, it worked out.
The luck would continue for Tom Hornbein and Willie Unsold, who pioneered the dangerous West Ridge route, ascending what is now known as the Hornbein Couloir on their way to the summit.
And every step they take is on terrain where no man or living creature has ever trod.
They rendezvoused in the dark with Lute Jersted and Barry Bishop, who reached the top from the south. Exhausted and unable to see the way down, they were forced to wait at 28,000 feet for the sun to light the way to safety.
Generally speaking, when you're in a tight situation, at least what I found, and I think many others besides me, is you just do what you got to do to try to succeed and stay alive and keep going. So it was a long, cold, pretty exotic night.
On all but a few nights in a whole year, they would have died in the cold and wind. But this was one night in 100. The mountain was merciful. The night was still and windless.
2 men left the mountain in a helicopter headed for Kathmandu and treatment for frostbite, and the whirlwind that would surround this climb was only just beginning.
At the press conference in New Delhi, we're being interviewed, Gombu and I, and they said to Gombu, what was the first thing you thought of after having reached the highest point of Earth? But he answered for me as well when they said, how, the first thing you thought of, he said, how to get down.
The weeks were a blur of receptions, medals, and meetings with heads of state, including a Rose Garden ceremony with President Kennedy.
We're very pleased that you brought with you as your guests those who went with you. I think it's very appropriate they should be here because they're very much a part of this great international effort.
President Kennedy and Gombu and I were standing there and we were chatting about the Sherpa, and he said, I hear they're very strong. And I said, oh, Mr. President, feel his thigh. And so when Gombu was standing there, the president, Gombu was the guy, and Gombu said if he's resurrected in the next life as a worm, he'll still remember the President of the United States grabbing him by the thigh. It was just amazing.
Gombu and 5 other Sherpas spent 3 months touring American cities, sampling the Western lifestyle, and at least once leveraging their new notoriety.
And there's a story, perhaps you've heard it, our psychologist drove them across the country in the States. They got a big station wagon from General Motors, and they drove. And sometimes they drove too fast. And there were people who were watching, policemen, and they wanted to give them a ticket. So Gombu said, you know who we are? We're the Sherpas, and we just came from the White House, and President Kennedy, and so on. And the policemen were so impressed that they said, oh, go on.
They returned to India via Paris and Japan. When Gombu arrived in Darjeeling, he learned he would receive his salary for the length of the expedition and the time he spent on tour. He also learned India was planning another expedition to Everest.
All my life I've been climbing mountains.
This time, Colonel Bul Kumar served as deputy director of the expedition. Captain M.S. Kohli was the expedition leader, and they asked Gombu to sign on. In his memoirs, Gombu says when asked to join the expedition, he replied, I've already climbed Everest in '63. Why should I go there again and again? But a promise of scholarships for 2 of his children and a piece of land would lure him back. He says he agreed only after being told he would be in the first summit party.
They find fixed troops left by the Americans a great help.
Gombu knew the route, he knew the hazards, and he knew the weather could freeze the expedition in its tracks. High winds and snow stalled the climb for nearly 3 weeks. But finally, in the middle of May...
This is All India Radio, and here is the weather bulletin for the Indian Everest expedition. Generally fair weather, isolated thundery developments possible on ridges during evening.
If this good weather holds for a couple of days, I'm thinking of sending the summit parties tomorrow. The first party will consist of Gombu and Chima.
7:30 a.m., May the 19th, Gombu and Chima, accompanied by Sherpas, leave South Col to establish the summit camp.
His climbing partner, Avtar Singh Chima, was an army captain in the parachute regiment. Their final camp rested on a snowy hump at nearly 28,000 feet.
May the 20th, 1965. Chima and Gombu are awake at 3 a.m. Gombu remembers when he reached the top with the American, James Whittaker. Can he do it again? Will he be the first man to have climbed Everest twice?
They reached the summit by 9:30 in the morning. This expedition would see a record-breaking 9 men make it to the top.
You know, those days Everest was a big thing. It was like the first time for Indians. And the whole nation was with you. So you were in the press, you were this, that and the other. And really the nation had their eyes on you. Well, so on the summit, the first thing is that the moment you reach on top, the temperatures was low, but it was a bright sun. It was a long wheeling look. You could see some of the giant mountains, from the top. Then you realize that, how small you are in front of this, immeasurable universe. And you realize that, your smallness and loneliness.
3 months after standing on top of the world, Ahluwalia was injured in the Indo-Pakistani War, an injury that forced him to use a wheelchair. He went on to start a spinal injury hospital in Delhi.
If you look back, the mountain teaches you that life is all about climbing the other summit, the summit of the mind. It's all on that, the spiritual mountain within yourself.
When he climbed with the Indian expedition, then there was much material gain. Yes, he was given a plot of land to build this house, and he was decorated with many medals, and he was a big celebrity overnight.
I used to very proudly introduce him, the only man in the world who has climbed Everest twice.
His success as a climber literally brought the world to his door.
People would come and visit, so we'd be sitting, somebody would just walk into the house, maybe in an afternoon, some tourist or something, yeah. Or they just come and they want to, is it Gombu's house? Yes, and they want to take pictures. They just want to come and take pictures.
In one sense, it was an odd way for a man of his background to become famous. Religious leaders taught young monks that mountain peaks were homes to the gods, sacred places not to be disturbed. And yet for this family, these remote, dangerous places became altars for advancement.
We owe it to the mountain because it's because of the mountain that made this family where it is today. A lot of people say it's like the first family in climbing and all that.
In fact, if you drew the family tree of this first family of climbing, many of its branches would spread across the highest parts of the Himalaya.
So in this area, I was most scared.
Gombu's brother-in-law, Dorje Latu, would summit Everest and many other mountains.
I feel grateful for come down alive.
Without mountaineering, I think we would have been ordinary Sherpas.
Latu's wife, Gombu's sister Doma, was a climber on an historic and dangerous expedition to Cho Oyu.
Rita Gombu, grandniece of Tenzing and daughter of Nawang Gombu, the first man to climb Everest twice, is the first Indian woman to cross 8,000 meters.
And Gombu's firstborn would have her chance at Everest in 1984 on an expedition that had the support of the government and the Gandhi family, who had promoted mountaineering for generations.
Well, adventure should be a part of everybody's life. I think that's the whole difference between being fully alive and just existing.
Whole aim of this expedition was to put an Indian woman on top.
Rita Gombu was one of 6 women and nearly a dozen men hoping to reach the summit.
Not only is she the chosen one, the first girl in the first summit attempt, but she also bears the additional responsibility of her family's mountaineering tradition.
So I was on the first summit team, but the weather was not too good, so I missed the summit by about 100 meters.
Very well done to Bachendri.
Bachendri Paul would succeed in reaching the top along with 3 men. And through the years, nephews, cousins, and grandsons of the Norgay Gombu clan would make their way on the mountain.
I think what was unusual about Gombu, for example, and I can speak to my father a little bit more, was they had a real desire to climb. They were very unusual as Sherpas, I think. They really wanted to go and do something. That's what they saw when they were children, looking up at Everest every day while they were grazing yaks. But for them it was first a passion and then also a way to support the family.
I mean, yes, it was fun, it was dashing, it was interesting to be a mountaineer, but he was primarily doing all of that stuff to provide for the family.
To meet expenses, he was all the time working.
His position at the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute was a secure government job, but the salary?
When I joined, Gombu's salary was 210 rupees. How much is that in dollars?
That was less than $30 at the time, not enough for his dream of sending the children to private schools.
He did anything to earn a little bit of extra money to keep us apart from everything else, you know.
He made some money buying and selling used climbing gear from expeditions returning to Kathmandu.
Every monsoon, when the expeditions seasons was over, he used to go there, and I used to sometimes go with him and buy the second-hand equipment, bring them across the border. It used to be almost amounting to smuggling in those days, because we were here. There was no allowance of foreign equipment coming in the country. So we used to bring it across the border, and here we had a good market in new Indian climbers coming up, and they were looking for European or American or Japanese make equipment.
Good, this is it. Summer rain here, buddy. Put it right there.
When his friends in the United States invited him to work on Mount Rainier in the 1970s, he found the perfect summer job.
But we had to teach him the technical knots and the ascenders and stuff, but he was a mountain man. He knew the mountains, and he's the guy that's going to be safe.
Lou Whittaker, twin brother to Gombu's American Everest climbing partner Jim Whittaker, was head of Rainier Mountaineering.
I told the guides, if you can just get half as good as Gombu, I'll hire you as a guide.
1971 was the first year I was working on Mount Rainier as literally a teenager.
Phil Urschler would meet Gombu at a bunkhouse at 10,000 feet after a long day of guiding in very bad weather.
We got into Camp Muir late. I was like a little drowned rat. Didn't know anything about the guide service. Didn't know really anything about the operation Mount Rainier. And at the end of the day, everybody's settling down to go to sleep. So I'm standing there holding my sleeping bag in a stuff sack, looking like a little lost puppy dog. And my first interaction with Gombu was Gombu just grabbed that sleeping bag from me. He pulled his sleeping bag and pad off of the bunk where he was, threw it under a table in there, down on a pile of frozen ropes, and pulled my bag out of that stuff sack, threw it on the bunk and said, "Phil, you sleep here." That's how I met Nawang Gombu.
Over here in the guide house, he would help Ingrid stack the ice axes back in their proper places, and he'd be handed a broom and sweep the floor, and then the concrete steps out in front of the guide house here. And he'd do all this just happy and enjoying it.
And he felt very proud that, you know, the fact that we didn't really have anything, like he had a small job, and going to Rainier was earning extra money. So I think that we owed a lot to Rainier also, you know, because all that money he got, that was to help us.
His American connections led to more expeditions.
Gombu not only climbed a lot with us on Mount Rainier, but one of my earliest guided trips on Mount McKinley up in Alaska in 1978 was with Gombu.
He helped guide 10 customers to the summit and became the first Sherpa to reach the peak of North America's tallest mountain.
It's just another mountain, you know, and it's like a call of duty, so it was not, none of the wives would ever interfere.
But as he grew older,
So I think it was in the 80s, the China Everest expedition, when my mom actually for the first time kind of told me to take him aside and tell him not to climb.
It was to be an ascent of the north face of Everest, launched from Tibet in 1982. China had only recently opened the route to outsiders after a nearly 40-year shutdown following the takeover of Tibet. 40 yaks carried the gear of the 17-member team to base camp. Lew Whittaker led the expedition. Jim Whittaker, the first American to summit K2, was one of the climbers.
He was clearly not planning to climb the mountain. He'd already climbed it twice. At this time, I think he was 49 years old. And in the early 80s, that was pretty old to be trying to climb Everest.
So I was like probably 10, 11, and so I sort of said yes. So I took him to the altar and made him promise he won't climb.
So he said, okay, I won't go up to the summit. I'll go only to the base camp.
So he went up, and I think the last few meters he sort of turned around and came down.
And when he came back, he said, I could have gone. He's saying I could have easily climbed.
If he had been climbing today, he would be one of these guys that would climb it a dozen times or 15 times.
That would not be the case this time.
Jim, I made a decision down here that I can live with real easy and be real happy with. I hope you make the same one up there.
The expedition ended after the only woman on the team, Marty Hoey, fell to her death, and bad weather prevented others from making a summit attempt.
He was always amazed at how he managed to survive, because he lost many good friends over the years in the mountains. He lost many of them.
He never wanted us to, become climbers or go into mountaineering as such, because for them, like, they did it as a job. It's not as a hobby.
But nobody wants to become a professional mountaineer because they don't want to risk their lives.
But he was very clear that he wanted us to go to an English school, so he made sure we did it.
Hello. Hello. Gombu was determined education would be their Everest. Minds instead of muscles would help his children rise in the world.
And then he put us all through English schools, because I think he said it was very important that you had to learn English. And at home also he would insist that, we have to speak in English. If you don't know how to speak English, then you won't go anywhere.
It was a lesson Gombu learned very young in life. His language skills gave him a huge advantage over other men looking for work.
He had this hilarious story where he would describe how, as a very young man, he would take this daily trek to the home of an Australian missionary in town, in Darjeeling, called Miss Rita. And he'd be all dressed up and spruced up, and he'd be taking the walk through the town to this lady's house. And all the other Sherpa climbers who weren't bothering to learn English would tease him mercilessly and call him a keener and make fun of him as he went to learn English. And he always said that in the end, he got the last laugh.
At his home in Darjeeling, Gombu had a small room where he could rest and read in the late afternoon sun. The bookshelves are filled with stories of the great mountains and the great mountain climbers, all of them written in English.
He learned how to read coming along, right? It's not that he would be able to hold a book and just scan through it the way we read. For him, it would need an effort to read.
Towards the end, he was reading books and all, so that was good. And then he would ask us for meanings.
He never went to a proper school, not really educated, but he knew everything. You can talk to him on any topic.
He was tireless in his efforts to use his achievements and the fame that followed to provide a better future, not only for his family, but for others who started out just like him.
We had to do a lot of letter writing for him. My older sister, Rita, it was her first, and then later on me. So, at the age of 10 and 11, writing official letters is not easy. So
there was always someone who was going to be going for a job, and there was someone who was going to need something or a recommendation, because it was either somebody who was a mountaineer or a Sherpa or their family, or it could be a widow or a child or whatever. He lobbied on behalf of these people endlessly.
He was very concerned about, all the deaths in the mountains. The Sherpa community, we have people dying on the expeditions, and people have problems. Suddenly the families don't get insurances.
Most of these Sherpas who climb Everest or who die on mountains are the breadwinners. For very little money, they risk their lives on that mountain day in and day out, for sometimes as little as $3,000 per season.
Gombu spent the last years of his life at the Sherpa Buddhist Monastery in Darjeeling, working on behalf of those left behind.
Since he was the only one who was well known after Tenzing in that circle, so he thought it was his duty to do whatever he could for the community.
Once a day at least, every day he'd go there. And he was keen on building the monastery.
He became head of the Sherpa Buddhist Association, which operates out of this humble space, raising money and awareness about the desperate problems some in the community faced.
He would call all the widows of the Sherpas who died on the Everest expedition, and money was given to them. Then there was another point in time when somebody, husband died and the wife didn't have money, so made sure that the funds were given.
Till his last breath, he was, talking about the Sherpa with his daughters, what should be done, what he wants.
Nawang Gombu ko parthiv sharir. Yes.
His last trek was a short drive from his home to the grounds of the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute. Nawang Gombu died in April of 2011.
Yeah, I'm going to get a picture of him plowing with his water.
He was not the kind of man who ever seemed impressed with his own accomplishments. A casual stranger would never suspect the heights he reached in his lifetime. A man who shook hands with monarchs and received the coveted Tiger of the Snow Award, the highest mountaineering honor given by India.
No, he remained a simple, humble man. He was, how would you say, down-to-earth kind of person. Till he died, yes.
While history focused on his mountaineering firsts, in the end he is remembered for so much more. His legacy cannot be measured by meters or vertical feet, but instead by the family he and his wife raised, the community he helped, and the stories told by the people whose lives were changed because of him.
He set an example, I think. He was a real gentleman and accommodating person. He would really bend over backward to help you out and so on. And I think that he set an example for the Sherpa community.
When I think of a guy like Gombu, I just think of this presence that made any of us, whether it was one of his customers or one of us young guides that was working with him, just want to aspire, want to be better, not to want to disappoint. That's a big deal.
I mean, he was just a great guy to be with in the mountains, never down. I mean, he was always optimistic, always up, and that's the kind of person you want to be around on an expedition.
He was a tough little fellow.
He was always pretty much I call a spade a spade.
He was short-tempered, very short-tempered, but golden hot.
Because he was also, I think, quite vocal, and he was not very diplomatic. He would, if he felt something, he would say it. So I kind of maybe inherited from him. I'm pretty vocal too.
He was very good in his judgment. He was focused on what he wanted, and I think that's how we are where we are.
She said that he was very hardworking and very caring, and he always wanted to help people. And because of, that's how he started doing well in life, and he was always concerned about everybody's welfare, not only his family, but the rest of the people in the community also.
He was the first man to climb Everest twice. He was a Sherpa, literally one of the two that made the Sherpa community famous. But other than that, I would rather say he's a pretty determined guy. He came with nothing, and then he put through 4 of us through school, and this is the first generation, and we are all living pretty comfortably. Yeah. So I think that's kind of more important than the medals.
My folks died when I was very little. Gombu and my sister, they raised me. For Sherpa people, for my people, he's just like their caretaker. He keeps the tribe together. And if I have 1/4 of his quality in my blood, I'll consider myself very, very successful.